Welcome back. This is week 3, lecture 1, the Augustinian Renaissance. And this lecture follows very naturally upon the previous lecture on the religiopolitics of the later Middle Ages, as I talked about with Boniface VIII and then John the 22nd, Louis of Bavaria, Boniface and Philip IV, because the Augustinians, as I mentioned and discussed, Giles of Rome, James of Viterbo, and Augustinus of Ancona, were central for creating the papal hierocratic theory, which is basically the position that the Pope, or the papacy, is the highest authority in Christendom. They can say, well, what about papal monarchy had arisen in the 13th century with Innocent III? Yes, that was part of it too, but as never before, in this papal imperial conflict, and there had always been, let's say, conflict or tensions in any case between princes and bishops and the Pope and the Emperor. With this 14th century, with the emergence of the 14th century, we see these conflicts being far more severe and dramatic, and that leads to a greater sense of urgency to settle the situation. And for the Augustinians, starting with Giles of Rome, they definitely take the papal side. Now, this is going to be important because all of this kind of leads up to Luther. Now, I've argued, also in my book that you'll be reading, and started reading the introduction in chapter 1, that this Reformation of the later Middle Ages should be seen as a distinct pattern of Reformation and not simply as a precursor to the Reformation. That begins with Luther. I'll be coming back to that issue. But because of the importance of the Augustinians to the emergence of Luther and the early Reformation, and because of the historiographical tradition, which I'll be talking about shortly, I need to address this issue more explicitly. And even though the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, I argue, was a distinct movement, so to speak, it still was the background for understanding the emergence of Luther. So the issue of papal power was central, became the central issue in some ways for the conflict that Luther became embroiled within. Not that he was wanting to approach it from that direction, but we'll see that we'll get there when we get there. And for over a century, since the late 19th century, throughout the 20th century, scholars have debated the extent to which Luther developed his theology based on Augustine and based on his having been an Augustinian hermit. In my view, that debate has been misplaced. It's been based on a theological understanding and is based on this distinction that is so prevalent still today. And I think even Lindbergh seems to adhere unconsciously to this position that the distinction between medieval Catholicism and Protestantism, or Lutheran Protestantism, is that Catholicism, the medieval church, advocated salvation by works, and and the Protestants advocated salvation by faith or by grace. That distinction is as false as it possibly could be, for reasons I'll get into. Because the whole charge that the medieval church advocated salvation by works was a Protestant charge against their opponents. And that is always dubious if we accept the reality of one side in a debate, historically, especially when a debate of such fierce issues and fierce sentiment going on here, because literally salvation was at stake, and the whole point was, what is salvation based on, and how do we get there? Now, I'll be talking about a lot of those issues as we go through later on. But the whole issue of Augustine and the impact and influence of Augustine both his works themselves and as the perceived founder of the Augustinian order, which we'll be talking more about today, had an impact of some sort. And the question is, to what extent? So that's kind of why this lecture is here. It's also the focus of my research and has been from the very beginning in many ways. So again, I'll try not to allow myself to go into too many rabbit holes, so to speak, of issues that I think are so important, but that are not all that pertinent to this course as such. So I ask your kind of patience and indulgence. There we go, indulgence. That word was something that we'll come back to. For presenting this material, and I'm trying to do so as clearly and as succinctly as possible for understanding the parameters of what we're talking about here in terms of the Reformation and as such, and then also the Reformation of the later Middle Ages in more particular. Now, that's kind of the contour and the context. When we look at this concept of the Augustinian Renaissance, a rebirth of Augustine, we have to realize that this is a historiographical concept more than a historical concept. People were not talking about, we need to effect a rebirth of Augustine, except we'll come back to that issue, in the 14th century. Except they did, and I'll explain that. The hermits did. I'll explain the context of that. But it has been a debate because of this theological debate that Augustine got himself involved in with the individual named Pelagius. And we're talking about Pelagianism, the debate between Augustine and Pelagius later. But just in terms of the complexity of the historiographical tradition, I'm going to go through just a little bit to give you a sense that it's not one or the other. It's not simply the medieval Catholic tradition was salvation by works, and then the Lutheran and the Protestants came up with salvation by grace. That's not the way it was at all, nor was that even a representation of the medieval position at all. And we see that too with the Augustinians, who were advocating a very strong position of salvation by faith and by grace based on predestination in the 14th century. Now, historiographically, then, this has become a problem because, as I think you can understand, Protestant scholars have a stake in this, as do Catholic scholars. And it's so interesting because you will find Catholic scholars and Protestant scholars arguing the same points, but for different positions or outcomes, so to speak. So here, if we look at the slide of the historiographical tradition, I have it there. And so position one, there's two basic positions in terms of the relationship between Luther and the late medieval tradition and Augustinian tradition. And one is that Luther received nothing from the late medieval theological tradition, but was his own unique theologian. Now, we will find Protestants and Catholics arguing that. The Protestant view that would argue that was Luther was completely distinct from anything that was medieval. The Catholic view is that, of course, Luther was distinct from anything that was medieval because Luther was a heretic. So that's position one. Position two, then, is that Luther was a product of the late medieval theological tradition. That position, too, has been argued both by Protestants and by Catholics. The Protestant view was that Luther was unique, but was in keeping with the medieval theological traditions, from which the church itself deviated. So what this position is that Luther was a faithful traditional Catholic, and that the theological tradition in some ways began to deviate from its own tradition. So Luther was not new and heretical. He was just more traditional. Excuse me. Whereas the Catholic view of this position, that Luther was a product, was somewhat similar in that the Catholic view is that, yes, Luther was a product of a late medieval theological tradition, but that late medieval theological tradition was corrupt. It was a deviation from the good medieval tradition that culminated in Thomas Aquinas. And so it's somewhat of a I can't even think of the word right now. It's too much condensed, but there is kind of a sense that if only Luther had read more Thomas, he would have never become the heretic that he was. There's a long historiographical tradition on that issue too, but this position that the late medieval theological tradition was corrupt. Or was it the culmination of the medieval theological tradition? That is a big question. It's been debated. And when we look at the tradition going further, besides these two basic points, argued both by Protestants and Catholics on each, we have the whole question then of what constitutes being Augustinian and what is Augustinianism. And that really has been the focus of my scholarship and my publications from the very beginning. And we can look at this in the sense of everything was Augustinian in many ways. Augustine, his influence was huge throughout the Middle Ages. It's been said that the Reformation, this goes back to 1950, work in the 1950s, but still it became a saying that has been quoted again and again, but I think it makes a lot of sense because it encapsulates really different positions. But the phrase is that the Reformation, internally considered, was simply the triumph of Augustine's doctrine of grace over Augustine's doctrine of the church. So even there we see, and this was a Protestant scholar who argued this, that we see there is this tension between the concepts of ecclesiology and soteriology, if you want to use theological terms, between the understanding of what is needed for salvation and its relationship to the church and the understanding of the church. And this is Paul Warfield. What Warfield argued was that there is a conflict within Augustine himself, and we see that kind of diverging in the Reformation. That, I would argue, is not actually accurate either. But it gets at something because of Augustine's or Augustine's influence was so immense, and it's difficult to really chart. We can look at what works of Augustine were known, what were appealed to, and one of the aspects of this, Augustine was never not known. Aristotle in the Middle Ages, we can point to a recovery of Aristotle beginning in the later 12th century on into the 13th century. Look at that real impact. But Augustine was, quote unquote, always there. So how do we chart a change in a position with respect to Augustine? One way scholars have done so is to look at an increased emphasis on the anti-Pelagian works. Again, I'm going to be talking about Pelagianism shortly. And that led my doctoral advisor, Heiko Obermann, to coin the phrase the Augustinian Renaissance, even though the phenomena had been talked about for quite a long time. But Obermann talked about this Augustinian Renaissance, and he saw it as a rebirth of an anti-Pelagian Augustinian position based on a campaign against what was perceived as the new Pelagians that led to Luther. Now, there's a lot of issues and problems with that thesis too. And Obermann, as brilliant as he was, also was coming at it from the Protestant side of things and had his own blind spots. And I'm not saying that I don't. I have my own blind spots. But it gets at something in terms of the actual development. Now, interestingly, Obermann based a lot of his interpretation primarily on a 14th century English theologian who was not a member of the Augustinian Hermits, um, Thomas Bradwardine. And Thomas Bradwardine wrote a very lengthy work, which still has never been edited, on the cause of God against the modern Pelagians. It is very questionable whether Luther knew this work. It's very questionable whether what impact this work actually had. But if we were to look just at Bradwardine, Obermann's thesis has a lot of weight to it. It makes a lot of sense. The question, though, is whether that one work by Thomas Bradwardine can define a lot of the other developments that Heiko saw as coming from it, so to speak. At the same time that Bradwardine was composing and publishing in the medieval sense in terms of making available his De Causa Dei contra Pelagianos Modernos, the case of God against the modern Pelagians, the Augustinian hermit Gregory of Rimini was lecturing on Peter Lombard's sentences at Paris. And already in the 1950s, Damas's Trapp, probably one of the greatest Augustan scholars of the later Middle Ages ever to have lived. He died a number of years ago already. And argued that Gregory was the best Augustan scholar of the Middle Ages, and he sees a real change in the approach to Augustine with Gregory of Rimini within the order, among the order's theologians. Gregory had a very strong Augustinian position on grace, predestination. And the question then becomes, did Luther know Gregory of Rimini? And that becomes a major debate based on very tenuous evidence. It is certainly possible. It is, though, certainly not conclusive that Luther knew the works of Gregory of Rimini. Luther references Gregory of Rimini. It refers to him as the best Augustan scholar of the Middle Ages, along with Bernard of Clairvaux, which Bernard didn't know Augustine all that well. So that shows that Luther is putting together two different theologians from two vastly different eras. But the point here is that every time that Luther references Gregory of Rimini, he could have gotten that from Gabriel Biel. Now, Gabriel Biel was not an Augustinian. Gabriel Biel was a priest and a member of the Devotio Moderna, which I'll be talking about in further lectures later on. I think I talk about the Devotio Moderna, or mention the Devotio Moderna in chapter 1. Anyway, but Luther, we know, studied Biel's commentary on the canon of the Mass in preparation for his own ordination and his own theological study. And Biel knew Gregory. So the issue is, did Luther read and know Gregory independently of Biel? That is a big question. Now, I'm going to leave that aside because there's no basis for actually determining that question. We're going to present the evidence for both a positive and a negative conclusion, but neither side is sufficient to actually win out, so to speak. It has to remain as an open question, in my view. I tend to say, probably not. Or if he did, not very much, and didn't really understand him very well, and hadn't read all that much of him. Certainly early on. It is the case that probably after 1518, he may have read more of Gregory himself, actually, but not before 1518. Anyway, that's another issue, so to speak. So even here with Obermann, he sees this development. And why? Because Luther talks about the new Pelagians, or at least about the Pelagians. So Obermann sees this new development, beginning with kind of Thomas Bradwardine and then Gregory of Rimini too, as one and the same, this campaign against the modern Pelagians that culminates in Luther and the Reformation. That's how Obermann portrayed it. That, I think, is very wrong. and it becomes then associated, that anti-Pelagian Augustine against the modern Pelagians becomes associated with the term Augustinianism. So we have to talk about late medieval Augustinianism. And then we have a whole new problem. And this is the problem with isms, and we'll see this again with Lutheranism, Calvinism, Augustinianism. We have it too with Thomism. Isms, basically every ism there is, even nationalism, was a creation of 19th century German historians and philosophers. What it does is returns a descriptive noun into a descriptive adjective into a substantive noun. There is something that is Augustinianism, as distinct from that which can be described as Augustinian. And there too, nominalism. I'm not going to deal with nominalism. It's a philosophical term, and it is as problematic as Augustinianism. I may come back to it later, because Luther was seen as a nominalist. It's also a Heiko issue. He made a lot out of it. It's very difficult to actually deal with and doesn't really affect our understanding of the development too much. If you're interested, let me know, and I'm happy to go into a lot more detail. It's more an issue with a philosophy issue with universals and how things are known, epistemology, and the fact that Luther referred to Occam, William of Occam, a Franciscan theologian of the 14th century, who actually was writing for Louis of Bavaria against John the 22nd in that combat or conflict with the Franciscans and John. Luther refers to him as my teacher. And so the question then too was, to what extent was nominalism, this philosophical movement, the cause of Luther's, for the Catholic view, aberrant theology, or for the Protestant view, correct rediscovery of the gospel? So that messes up the water and muddies the water even further. And so I don't want to really deal with that here, except to the extent that I need to mention it, because I think Limburg mentions it, and I probably talk more about it in my book a bit, but it has often been seen as the opposite of Augustinianism. That too is ahistorical, because Gregory of Rimini and many of the later 14th century Augustinian hermits were Augustinians as members of the order. They adhered to a strong, quote unquote, anti-Pelagian Augustinian position on grace and free will and predestination, and they were nominalists too. So we can't really say that an Augustinian position and a nominalist position are opposites. Not at all. But that's how they have been portrayed. So I want you to be aware of that fact, and I can go further into the details of both. If you're interested, just let me know. Because this all gets very complex, and you can understand what's at stake. What's at stake is the understanding of what was going on in the Reformation. And theologically, it's an issue of who can be saved. Basically, it's still that kind of an issue. We can just say, oh, it doesn't matter because everybody is saved, or it's all hooey anyway, and it's all illusion and superstructure that we don't have to worry about because it's all hallucination, so we don't have to worry about that. Anyway, fine. But for the people at the time, it was central. So to understand what was going on at the time, we need to understand something about it. And then the problem we have is, how do we access what was going on at the time except by means of what other scholars, contemporary scholars, have written about it? And that's where the historiographical tradition comes into play, and our need to understand, let's say, the filter through which we learn about these things. That's what I'm talking about and getting at. Now, this all leads, this whole debate, and the historiographical debate, and the confessional positions, Protestant and Catholic, have led to a huge confusion in terms of the terminology used and in terms of the actual developments. So my argument has been that we need to have a new beginning to approach the late medieval tradition, the theological tradition, and particularly the late medieval Augustinian tradition, whatever that might have been, and tried to come to an historical understanding rather than a theological understanding. That distinction is one that you've read about in the essays that I post on history, myth, and theology. I've talked about that distinction early on, and it's a very important distinction to make for this course between a theological interpretation and an historical interpretation. And my point with late medieval Augustinianism and all that I've published on it is that we need to have an historical account, not a theological one. Because a theological account that's based on an erroneous historical account is bad theology. I would argue that's a theological argument and not what this course is about. But this is the historical side of things. Now, so looking at it historically, we have to look then at the origins of all of this, and that gets us then into the debate between Pelagius and Augustine and what is Pelagianism, leaving aside the problem of the ism, because that is a problem. And this goes back to the 4th century and on to the 5th century. I'm not going to go into the whole history of Augustine and Pelagius. It gets to be a big issue. But the issue is Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, who dies in 430 CE. And I would love to teach a whole course just on Augustine. But he was Bishop of Hippo. He entered into a number of conflicts, theological conflicts. And Pelagius, his debates with Pelagius became a major one, and a later one, one of the last ones. Pelagius was a British monk, a devout Christian, and Pelagius was scandalized when he went to Rome and visited Rome and saw what he considered to be a complete lack of piety and religiosity. So he saw Christians, people who were calling themselves Christians, who were not living a Christian life in his view whatsoever. Now, he had known of Augustine. He even went to try to meet Augustine once in Carthage. They missed each other. And Pelagius had read some of Augustine's early works that he liked. So when he came across a copy of Augustine's Confessions, he was scandalized. Because in Book 10 of the Confessions, Augustine repeats, I think, at least 7 or 8 times a phrase, a refrain, let's say. Grant what you will. Grant what you will and command. No. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I made this. It's like, grant what you command and command what you will. It's like, you give me the power, this is Augustine talking to God, as long as you give me the power, you can command me to do anything, as long as you give me the ability to do it. Now that gets into all of Augustine's interpretation. But Pelagius viewed this as, what are you talking about? Because if we are reliant on God to enable us to do what he commands, what's the whole point of the command? Then we're just puppets. Did not God command too, through Jesus, be ye perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect? God would not have given us a command. Jesus would not have given us a command if we could not fulfill it. Jesus didn't say, grow wings and fly. An impossibility. He said, be ye perfect. Therefore, we have the capability of being perfect. How are we perfect? By the use of our will. The problem with Christians today, Pelagius saw, was that they are weak-willed. We have to be stronger. We have to be elite. We have to be perfect. And we are commanded to be perfect, and therefore we can't. Now, it's a moralism, and it's a moralism of the elite. That only the elite who are perfect are the true Christians. Now, Augustine had seen a similar argument, but with different issues, with the Donatist controversy, which he also stood against the Donatist position, and that I may come back to at some point, but for now, that's a historical phenomena of the 3rd and 4th century, the 4th century. I'll leave it there. And so when he saw this kind of assertion that Christianity is for the elite, the pure, Augustine stood staunchly against it, because for Augustine, Christianity is for everybody. And the issue for Augustine was that we're all sinners. Now, Augustine has been attributed as having developed the whole concept of original sin. That is debatable, but whether or not he emphasized original sin is unquestionable. He did, especially in terms of his debate with Pelagius. Because Augustine's position was, we cannot be perfect. We are in a state of sin. And here we get to a major distinction between Pelagius and Augustine over sin. Pelagius saw sin as individual acts. I can sin or not sin. I have a choice. Augustine thought, no, we are in a state of sin. After the fall of Adam and Eve, we are in a state of sin, whereby individual sins are almost irrelevant. No, they're not for Augustine. He certainly does not advocate going out and sinning, whatever. But he said, but it doesn't matter. The formulation he used was that in paradise, as created originally, Adam and Eve had the ability to sin or not to sin. After the fall, after they blew it, human beings are not able not to sin. And in heaven, the saved souls will not be able to sin. 3 different stages and states. And this state, after the fall, but before salvation, is the state, being in the state of not being able not to sin. Non posse non peccare. Because we are in a state of sin. Because Augustine defined sin as being turned upon oneself, self-interest. And does that mean that everything we do is sinful? No. He says we can do good things. But every good thing we do is still tainted with original sin of the fall, which was, again, turning to oneself away from God. And so cannot be perfectly perfect. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do good things. We should do good things. It's just that no human good work is sufficient because it is tainted by being in a state of sin. And only God can free us from that state of sin. So is it good to give alms? Is it good to donate to charities? Yes. But the issue is, it makes you feel good, doesn't it? That's the self-interest. We start doing things for ourselves, not simply for God. Now, even if we say we're doing it for God, it's like, well, we can, and Luther even developed that to the point where saying that, it's like the resignatio ad infernum. You should live your life as if you are resigned and condemned to hell, because then you will do it correctly, not for your own benefit. Anyway, that's another point in some ways. But that was Augustine's point. So for Pelagius, he did not deny the impact of the fall, because obviously we're not in paradise. But for Pelagius, we are all in the same state as was Adam and Eve. The playing field has changed. But we are all in a state of being able to sin or being able not to sin. And Pelagius said we must focus on that being able not to sin. And what is the basis for that? Our free will and our choices that we make. Augustine would say we cannot will to be perfect. That is only something that God can bring about in us. Even if we do good, even if we do the right things, there's still an element of self-interest involved, of sin involved, because we are in a state of sin. Now, that was the debate. And it has a lot of different impacts, such as on baptism. Should babies be baptized? Augustine was a strong purporter of infant baptism. Because if you die not having been baptized, you go to hell. the Pelagian position was like, but babies are innocent. And Augustine says, no, they're not innocent. All they do is think about me, 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 me. And having had two, I can say that's for sure. They're about as self-absorbed as possible. So Augustine said, we need to have baptized babies because we don't want to allow unbaptized babies to go to hell. We have to save them. So that affects the whole sacramental system, as well as then the theological views of justification and salvation, etc. And it affects the views of the church and the power and influence of the church, and on we go. I'm not going to spell out all those differences, but this issue between Augustine and Pelagius is almost a fissure within the Christian tradition, just as the Donatism was, and the Donatist position was. And Augustine, too, won out. And Augustine's position, based on predestination, grace, and salvation, does not deny moral responsibility, as Pelagius claimed. It just says that our moral responsibility basically doesn't have much, if anything, to do with salvation. Salvation is not based on our moral qualities. The thief on the cross was not a moral person, but he's the first person Jesus saved. Number one. Number two, Christianity is for everybody. It was only for the elite, the moral elite. No. Christianity is for everyone. Everyone are sinful because we're in a state of sin. The Pelagius position was condemned in 418. The issue was that we humans cannot be perfect. We cannot will to do the good. Once that position was condemned, no one argued, I'm a Pelagian. No one argued that we are justified by works ever. The question is, how do we navigate these two positions? Pelagius's moral responsibility, morality as basis of salvation, or works basis of salvation, and Augustinian position of predestination. So we get all kinds of attempts to mitigate between these two extremes, because what do you do if you go into to preach? You can't go in and preach predestination. It doesn't help much, because the whole point of preaching is to encourage people to live better lives, to transform themselves. Now that gets into all kinds of issues in terms of doctrine, in terms of pastoral care. You're reading for this week Jordan's Quedlinburg's exposition on the Lord's Prayer. In some ways, Jordan was very much advocating for people to do the right thing and to practice, and it works. And yet Jordan also argued for a very strongly Augustinian position of predestination. And you'll be reading more about him in my Luther book. But the point being is that it's not so clear cut. Aside from the fact that no scholar from 418 on explicitly argued that we are justified and saved by works. Period. It's all by grace. It's just, how does that work out? Now, a scholar back in the 1950s, I think it was, wrote like 5 volumes or 3 volumes on medieval doctrines of grace and identified like 12 different types of grace. It becomes very complex in terms of working out how grace actually works. How do we receive grace? On what basis? Well, grace can only be received by grace, and so it becomes very messy. So it is an attempt to say, okay, how can we fuse human morality? Because even Jesus is preaching to do the right thing and sin no more when he tells, the woman who's being stoned, go and sin no more. I don't condemn you either. So it's like, okay, how do we put these all together? That was the struggle, and had been the struggle all along. Now, that being said, if that provides the contours, we can then go on to see in the later Middle Ages there was this sense of the Pelagians are back. There's a new Pelagians. But that view was not nearly as widespread as Obermann thought. It was there in Thomas Bradwardine. Luther talks about the new Pelagians, basically. A lot of the very anti-Pelagian Augustinians, though, did not. So we cannot identify Augustinianism with anti-Pelagianism or the campaign against the new Pelagians. So what were the Augustinian position like historically, not theologically, but historically? And here we go back to last lecture in the religio-politics. And here I know I can talk a lot more about it, but I'm spending more time than I had hoped already in the background. And we have up here on the slide the true sons of Augustine, because it was in this debate, this political debate between the Pope and the Emperor, and Giles of Rome, James of Viterbo, Augustinus of Ancona, then William of Cremona, who was the prior general of the Augustinian order, were all involved. And John the 22nd, when he received and saw a copy of Marsilius Apagio's Defensor Pacis, which, as I argued for the abolition of the papacy, he turned to William of Cremona, the prior general of the Augustinian hermits, said, please refute this. And William did. He wrote a treatise refuting 6 of the doctrines that John had pulled out. He said, here, this large treatise, here are the 6 most important points. Please refute these. William of Cremona did. Augustinus of Ancona, who had already been involved in the conflict, writes his Summa de Ecclesiastica Potestate Ecclesiastica, a summation, a complete comprehensive treatment of ecclesiastical power, dedicates it and sends it to John. John was so pleased with William of Augustinus of Ancona that he sent Augustinus 100 gold florins and said, I'll give you a yearly salary if you continue to write books for me. William of Cremona asked for something different, though. The body of Augustine. Now, keep in mind, Augustine dies in 430 CE. According to tradition, his body was taken from Hippo first to Sardinia because the Vandals were invading North Africa, and then after the Vandals, Muslim forces took over South Africa. There was 2 translations, as it's called. Translation is a translatio, a moving across, first to Sardinia, and then from Sardinia, his body was brought to Pavia in northern Italy. And it was in the Church of St. Peter's in Pavia. And William of Cremona said, to John the 22nd, after he had written for John, and John said, what can I offer you? And William says, it's only right that the true sons of Augustine should be reunited with their father and be in charge of his tomb. So as of now, who's in charge of the tomb at Pavia? The Augustinian canons. Now, this gets confusing too. There are 2 monastic groups, both Augustinian. The Augustinian canons, which developed in the 11th century as part of this new monasticism, and then the Augustinian hermits, which were established in 1256, and on we go, who are a mendicant order. And this grant of John the 22nd, because after William said, shouldn't that be the case? And William says, absolutely. And so in 1327, on January 20th, 1327, John the 22nd issues his bull Veneranda Sanctorum, granting custody of Augustine's tomb to the hermits, together with the canons, and claiming that the hermits had the right to build a new monastery in Pavia next to St. Peter's, and that they were to share all aspects because the hermits were the true sons of their father, teacher, leader, and head, Augustine. This set off a huge conflict with the canons. You say, well, why? Well, this was splitting the income of a parish. There's conflict. There's real effects here. And there was a showdown in the cathedral, and the canons are saying, no, we're not going to acknowledge this unless you can show that the Pope actually said this. And they couldn't because Louis of Bavaria was camped in Pavia. And Louis is against John. So there's all this political problems going on at the same time. It was only then, after some of that then it became possible that the hermits could establish themselves in Pavia. I mean, they already had a house in Pavia, just not in charge of Augustine's tomb. And kind of by the mid 1330s, they had basically won out, and we started having a lot more of donations to the hermits and to the canons, and on we go from there. But this was a huge conflict, and the ideological conflict over who were the true heirs of Augustine, the true sons of Augustine, continued throughout the later Middle Ages, and Luther was aware of it. And he took the side of the hermits, because he was a hermit, after all. Now, this led to a number of developments. One, the need to prove their case for the hermits. That was done in a couple of ways. One, a new history of Augustine, a new biography of Augustine, written by Jordan of Quedlinburg. It also gets very complex. And Jordan did write a new life of Augustine, portraying him as the founder of the hermits and proving that he was the founder of the hermits. And he had new sources. He had new evidence. A collection of sermons known as Augustine's Sermons to his hermits, no, to his brothers in the hermitage, the Sermones ad fratres suos in Eremo. This collection of sermons was not legitimate. There were 2 authentic sermons of Augustine, but the rest were forgeries. Either forgeries consciously, or just sermons that had become attributed to Augustine, but were not by Augustine. They were not authentic. And a number of this collection, a number of sermons, I've argued and proved, could only have been written after 1327. These were then, quote-unquote, forged. So it's a complex collection, and the original collection consisted, I've shown and argued, of 23 sermons. That collection grew over time throughout the later Middle Ages, so the final collection consisted of 76 sermons. So more were being added to it. But especially in these sermons that were, quote-unquote, forged, that could only have been written after 1327, is clear proof that Augustine established and founded his hermits before his canons. And Jordan wrote a new biography of Augustine accordingly. That gave evidence and proof for the hermit's cause. Canons didn't accept that. They refuted it, and they questioned the authenticity. And that debate goes on throughout, as I said, the rest of the later Middle Ages. Now, another thing that Jordan did was he wrote his Liber Vitas Fratrum, or Life of the Brothers, because he was asked. This was completed by 1349. This Liber Vitas Fratrum, and John of Basel, who was became one of the outstanding Augustinian hermit theologians of the later Middle Ages, asked Jordan, how do we know who's a true son of Augustine? And Jordan answered with his Liber Vitas Fratrum. And in this book, it's the only book, besides the Exposition of the Lord's Prayer, which I edited, and also the Life of Augustine, which I've edited, Liber Vitas Fratrum was edited in 1943, and translated somewhat more recently. Not by me, by somebody else. This was Jordan's answer. And here he goes through extensively. It's a long work. It's basically a commentary on the rule and constitutions of the order. And it became very influential within the order and important for the order. And Jordan, too, goes through and claims that the Augustinian life following Augustine as the rule and example of all that we do is what we're called to do. And that means living the most perfect life, not just the vita perfecta, but the vita perfectissima, the most perfect life. So this gets into the whole conflict between the Augustinians and the Franciscans also in the political context with John the 22nd, because the Franciscans were supporting Louis of Bavaria against John the 22nd because John had condemned the Franciscan ideal. And here, Jordan was arguing that the Augustinians were the highest form of Christian perfection. And why could they be? Because they combined the active and the contemplative life. And you could be a bishop, you could be a pope, and do that. Whereas for the Franciscans, you had to be a Franciscan. John the 22nd wasn't a Franciscan. But for the Augustinian position, the most perfect life did not mean that you had to be a member of the Order of Hermits of St. Augustine. It was a way of life, a religio Augustini, the religion of Augustine, was the most perfect form of life. That's how you could know. Following Augustine. And there even was then a story that came about in terms of the real rebirth of Augustine, that Augustine himself had brought about the establishment and foundation of his Order of Hermits, which had been dispersed. But in a vision, Augustine appeared to Pope Alexander IV. And he appeared to Alexander IV with a large head, but basically diminished, nothing much in his body, and exhorted Alexander to reunite his body with his head, his followers, which Alexander did in his Bull Legit Ecclesiae, establishing the Order of Hermits of St. Augustine in 1256, April of 1256. And Jordan recounts this dream. He did not create it. It was there mentioned before him. But that gets into a whole other issue. About creating Augustine was about all of this. That it was the re-embodiment of Augustine. The order was the re-embodiment of Augustine, uniting the members with the head and members, which is very much a concept of the church. The Pope is the head, everybody else are the members. The body of Christ. Christ is the head, everyone else are the members. That imagery was then applied by Jordan to the order itself, head and members, whereas then Augustine is the head and the members of the order are the members. And that is how we know, to the extent to which we follow the example of Augustine in all things. Augustine had been re-embodied, had been reborn. And in this sense, this is a true, genuine Augustinian Renaissance in the sense of a historical development in imagery. It has nothing to do with Pelagianism or countering Pelagianism, even as this attempt to be the embodiment of Augustine and to follow Augustine in all things led to, within the order, to a new focus on being a scholar of Augustine. Have appeared Augustinian scholarship and theology. So if we are going to be Augustine's true sons, we have to know Augustine better than anybody else. We have to return to the sources. We have to go back ad fontes, return to the sources. And that's what they started to do. And we have, with Gregory of Rimini, beginning with Gregory of Rimini in the early 1340s, we have then this new emphasis on Augustine scholarship, knowing Augustine better than anybody else, and therefore, too, looking at Augustine's anti-Pelagian works and then trying to bring together Augustine's thought as a whole, the ecclesiology and the soteriology, which is what they were doing. So the political re-embodiment of Augustine, let's say, from William of Cremona, Augustinus of Ancona, through to Jordan of Quedlinburg, and others were involved as well, which I haven't talked about here, paved the way for this scholarly, theological reappropriation of, let's say, the whole Augustine, not just citing Augustine here and there to support whatever position you wanted to advocate, but to really say, let's focus on what was Augustine arguing himself, because that's what we have to do. We have to follow Augustine, not just use Augustine for our own purposes. That emphasis on returning to the sources, on actually reading the texts of Augustine, paved the way for a more general movement of returning to the sources, namely the Italian Renaissance. And Francesco Petrarca, who's often seen as the father of the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, was very close with the Augustinian hermits, a number of different Augustinian hermits. And that's a whole nother development. But I would argue that this Augustinian Renaissance, this historical Augustinian Renaissance, paved the way not only for the Reformation, but also for the Italian Renaissance. It's a big issue. I just wanted to present that to you here. And I don't have time to go in and explain it all, but I can give you references if you're interested in going into more detail. But that is what was going on within the order. A return to an Augustinian theology with the primacy of grace, a primacy of love, and actually intently reading Augustine's works. And that was what led to following in the footsteps of Augustine and actually being an Augustinian. Now, this is the last slide here, being an Augustinian, theological or historical understanding of the Religio Augustini, the religion of Augustine. All those things I've already really talked about, because it changed in the later 15th century. The schism, which I'll be talking about again, I've talked about already some, was huge. The observant movement was huge. I'll be talking more about that too later on. And this 14th century Augustinian Renaissance, which was both in this overall general desire to follow in the footsteps of Augustine, to be the re-embodiment of Augustine, to know Augustine better than anybody else, ended up falling by the wayside. So was Luther an Augustinian? Well, he was a member of the order. But did he inherit the sense of being the re-embodiment of Augustine? Not at all. He did not even know any of his own order's theologians. You say, well, wait a minute. Like you said, he may have known Gregory of Rimini. He may have known a little bit of Gregory of Rimini. It's questionable. It is theoretically possible that he may have read Jordan's Liber Vetus Fratrum, maybe, but we can't prove that. He does take the side of the hermits against the canons. There's no real evidence that he had read the Sermones ad Fratre Suos and Eremo. He just took the hermit's side because the canons were arguing, and actually not against the canons, but Jakob Feigeling, who was a German humanist and convert from Judaism, I think. We'll have to go back and check. Sorry about that. He argued that Augustine said, this is a bunch of monk squabbling. Augustine had never been a monk or a canon or a hermit. He was a secular priest. He was a bishop. And Luther's like, you got to be kidding me. Of course he was a hermit and a monk. He was a monk for Luther. And so, why? So Luther took the side of the hermits in that kind of debate. But then, and that debate was still going on, just as then the whole Luther issue came to light, and the causa Augustini, let's say, the cause of Augustine, the case of Augustine, takes on very different connotations, because Luther started to appeal to Augustine as evidence of him being correct and right. That is the context, then, of what's going on. Already in 1516, Luther says, to say that Augustine spoke excessively anywhere is a heresy, is itself a heresy. He didn't speak excessively. Okay, we'll get there when we get there. But that is kind of why this concept of the Augustinian Renaissance is so important for this course, because it plays into both the Reformation of the later Middle Ages and Luther's Reformation. It is the direct connection between those two. Now, I don't expect you to know all the details, but I want you to know the general contours and how this religio-political side of things led to the theological, academic, scholarly side of things, the attempt to follow in Augustine's footsteps, to be the re-embodiment, to be the true son of the leader, teacher, father, and head, and what impact that had, which is far greater than most scholars have ever realized. Anyway, that's what this is all about. And did it have an impact or a role to play in the Reformation? Yes. But how it did, in what ways, we'll see as we go through. Even John Calvin said, Augustinus totus noster. Augustine is entirely on our side. So we will talk about these things as we go further. All right, that's it for now. Thank you very much, and I will be back again. Bye-bye.